One daughter is a doctor, the other one is a maid," my father announced, raising his glass in front of 18 guests at our family Christmas dinner. And then he laughed. And then they all laughed. My 9-year-old daughter was sitting right next to me. She tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, is being a maid bad?" That was the last Christmas I stayed silent, because what I said next in front of every single person at that table changed everything. He hasn't hosted a holiday dinner since, but before I tell you what I said that night, you need to understand what happened in the 7 years before, and why the man my father was trying so hard to impress all evening was the one person in that room who already knew exactly who I was. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 34 years old. I'm a single mom, and for the past 7 years my family has called me the maid. Now let me take you back to the autumn of 7 years ago, starting with the week I moved home. My hands were locked onto the freezing steering wheel of my beat-up sedan. The car's heater was broken, blowing nothing but bitter October air. In the back seat, my 3-year-old daughter Chloe was crying. It was a high, thin wail that cut right through the dark silence of the highway. "Daddy," she sobbed, clutching her blanket. "Where is Daddy?" I swallowed hard, tasting the dry panic in my throat. I didn't have an answer for her. Honestly, I barely had answers for myself. My ex-husband had vanished on a Wednesday. He cleared out our only checking account on a Thursday. By Friday, the divorce papers were mailed from his mother's address. Just like that, the foundation of my life had cracked and collapsed. By Saturday night, I was driving the 3 hours to Crestwood, Washington, sorting through the wreckage of my life like a bad eviction. 3 cheap suitcases. 1 diaper bag. That was my entire net worth. The gravel crunched sharply under my tires as I pulled into the massive sweeping driveway of my parents' 50-acre estate. The main house loomed in the dark night, a giant shadow of wealth, locked doors, and perfection. I stepped out into the freezing wind, pulling Chloe onto my hip. The cold bit into my skin. The heavy oak front door swung open before I even reached the porch steps. My father Harrison stood in the doorway. He wore a crisp sweater, perfectly pressed. He didn't step outside into the cold to help me. He didn't reach out his arms for his crying granddaughter. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked down to my scuffed suitcases, then slowly back up to my face. A muscle ticked in his jaw. Disappointment radiated off him, colder than the winter air. "The cottage out back is empty," he said. His voice was completely flat, slicing through the quiet night. He didn't blink. "This is temporary, Claire. Don't turn it into a habit. No hug. No asking if we were okay, or if we needed a warm meal. Just terms and conditions." I didn't argue. I couldn't. I dragged my bags through the thick, wet grass, walking past the heavy line of giant Douglas fir trees that hid the old 400-square-foot cottage from the main house. It was deliberately out of sight, out of mind. I unlocked the peeling front door and pushed it open. The air inside felt thick and abandoned. It was a single room with a tiny kitchenette and a bathroom where the shower ran ice-cold after exactly 5 minutes. There was no lease, no paperwork, just my father's heavy, unspoken control. That first night, there wasn't even a bed. I laid a single itchy wool blanket on the hard, dusty floorboards. I pulled Chloe tight against my chest, feeling her tiny, rapid heartbeat against mine. The single-pane windows rattled violently in their frames as the wind howled outside. The shadows in the corners of the room felt like they were stretching, closing in on us. I stared up at the pitch-black ceiling, tears finally stinging my eyes, hot and sharp. I was entirely alone, trapped in a cold cage built by my own family. But as I lay there in the freezing dark, listening to the wind, a tiny rock-hard knot of survival began to form in my chest. I just didn't know yet how much I would have to fight to protect it. Within a week, my hands were raw. The skin around my knuckles cracked and bled from the cheap bleach I used. I was knocking on heavy oak doors across Crestwood, offering to clean for $20 an hour in cash. A kind, elderly neighbor watched Chloe while I scrubbed porcelain bathtubs and mopped gleaming hardwood floors. I folded velvet towels in sprawling pantries for women who lived the life I thought I was supposed to have by now. I learned how to make old brass fixtures shine. More importantly, I learned how to hold my breath, step softly, and become completely invisible in someone else's home. I was a ghost pushing a mop, silently counting the dollars in my head just to buy milk and bread. That same month, my older sister Elena finished her dermatology residency. To celebrate, my parents threw a lavish dinner party for 24 people in the main house. I was late. I had been on my hands and knees scraping dried wax off a client's baseboards across town. I ran back to the freezing cottage in the dark and scrubbed my hands with dish soap, desperately trying to get the sharp chemical smell off my skin. I threw on my only clean black dress, took a deep breath, and walked up the gravel path toward the glowing windows of the main house. When I pushed the heavy dining room doors open, the room was a blur of crystal wine glasses, silver platters, and loud chatter. Then, the laughter stopped. Every head turned toward me. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavy and thick. My father, Harrison, stood at the head of the long polished table. He held a glass of expensive red wine. He didn't miss a beat. His eyes flicked over my damp hair and my worn shoes. A cruel, practiced smile spread across his face. "Sorry Claire's late," he announced, his voice booming loud enough to bounce off the crystal chandelier. She was busy scrubbing someone's bathtub. A ripple of uncomfortable chuckles echoed around the table. My face burned. My chest tightened so hard I couldn't pull in a breath. I looked at Elena, sitting in the seat of honor. She just stared down at her expensive linen napkin and looked away. Not a single word of defense. I pulled out an empty chair at the far end of the table and sat down in the crushing silence. I didn't say a word. That was the first time he used me as a punchline. It would not be the last. The truth is, the jokes didn't start when I moved home broken and broke. They started long before I ever packed my bags. Growing up in that house, there was a clear line drawn in the sand. Elena was the golden investment. She got the expensive SAT tutors, the summer science camps, the cross-country flights to tour Stanford and UCLA. When she got accepted to medical school, my father didn't even blink. He took out a massive second mortgage to cover her tuition. Every penny, handed over with a proud smile. When it was my turn, I remembered sitting at the kitchen table proudly holding my college acceptance letters. Harrison didn't even look at the papers. He just folded his hands, leaned in, and delivered the verdict. "Community college is plenty for someone like you, someone like me, someone like you." Those 3 words still echoed in my head every time I closed my eyes. They felt like a life sentence. So I went to Pinecone Community College. I paid every single dime myself. I waitressed until midnight, babysat on weekends, and mopped the church floors on Monday mornings. I graduated in 3 years with top honors. Nobody came to the ceremony. I sat in the folding chair in the gymnasium, clutching my cheap paper diploma, staring at the empty seats in the back row where my family was supposed to be. Now at every Christmas, every Easter brunch, Harrison would stand up and introduce us the exact same way. "This is my daughter, Dr. Elena Donovan Vance." He would beam with pride. Then he would wave a careless hand in my direction, almost like an afterthought. "And this is Claire. Not Claire who graduated with honors. Not Claire who is working herself to the bone to raise a child on her own. Just Claire." My mother, Margaret, never once corrected him. If I ever dared to bring it up, she would sigh heavily, rub her temples and look at me like I was a problem to be solved. "Your father just wants the best for both of you," she would whisper, her eyes darting nervously. "Don't be so sensitive, Claire. You're ruining the mood." But here is the dark, heavy secret that nobody at those sparkling holiday tables knew. Elena's medical school cost $500,000. My father only covered half of it. The rest was $210,000 in federal loans, a massive, suffocating mountain of debt that Elena was carrying silently, invisibly, while everyone toasted to her perfect success. But in the Donovan family, the image was everything. And my image as the failure had already been carved in stone. At least that's what they thought. The epiphany didn't come in a boardroom. It came at 6 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday, while I was standing on a marble countertop, unscrewing the filter of a $10,000 HVAC unit in a house that sat empty 10 months out of the year. By my 3rd year back in Crestwood, I had scrubbed, polished, and maintained over 75 homes. My hands were permanently calloused, but my mind was sharper than ever. I didn't just clean, I observed. The Willamette Valley was sprawling with massive multi-million-dollar vacation estates. They were owned by tech executives and surgeons who lived in Seattle or Portland, people who only drove down 5 weekends a year, and I noticed the fatal flaw in their perfect lives. These massive houses were bleeding money and patience. They needed constant aggressive management. Landscapers didn't show up. Pipes froze in the dead of winter. Security alarms tripped in the middle of the night. The wealthy owners were trying to manage fragmented, unreliable vendors from 300 miles away. They were drowning in headaches. They didn't need a maid. They needed a ghost, a unified, high-end concierge who could walk a plumber through the front door at 8 a.m., authorize a roof repair at noon, and lock up after a private caterer at 1 a.m. Nobody in the valley was offering that. So I decided I would. But in Crestwood, secrets were currency and my father was the bank. If I registered a business locally, the town clerk would whisper it to the baker, who would tell the country club bartender, who would serve it straight to Harrison on a silver platter by Friday evening. He would scoff. He would interfere. Or worse, he would claim it was his idea to help me. I couldn't breathe a word of it. It had to be a ghost operation. At 3 a.m., wrapped in that same itchy wool blanket, the blue light of a second-hand laptop illuminated the tiny freezing cottage. I listened to Chloe's soft, even breathing from the mattress on the floor. Every time the wind rattled the single-pane glass, I flinched, half expecting my father's heavy footsteps on the gravel outside, coming to inspect my failure. My heart hammered against my ribs as I typed out the legal forms. I filed for an LLC in Oak Ridge, the next town over. I rented a commercial P.O. box under a false sense of security. I named it Juniper Property Management. A juniper tree survives the harshest, coldest winters by digging its roots deeper into the dark earth. It felt right. By the end of that month, I had quietly signed 4 property contracts. Real contracts. Real money. I was terrified, exhausted, and for the first time in my life, violently proud. I needed to share it. I needed just one person in my bloodline to look at me and see something other than a disappointment. I found my mother, Margaret, in the main house kitchen the next afternoon. The room smelled of expensive vanilla candles and roasting garlic. She was sitting at the sprawling marble island, flipping through a glossy architectural magazine. She didn't look up when my worn boots scuffed the floor. "Mom," I started. My voice trembled just a fraction. I clutched the folded contract confirmation in my jacket pocket like a shield. "I need to tell you something. I just signed 4 clients. I'm building a property management firm." I waited for the shift. I waited for her eyes to widen, for the magazine to drop, for a smile to break through the polite icy mask she always wore. Margaret slowly turned a glossy page. The paper made a sharp, tearing sound in the quiet kitchen. She didn't lift her eyes. "That's nice, honey," she murmured, her tone as flat and dismissive as if I had told her it was raining outside. She tapped her manicured fingernail against a photo of a modern living room. "Oh, before I forget, Elena just got invited to speak at a dermatology conference in Chicago. The keynote address. Your father is already looking at flights for us." The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, the edge of the paper cutting into my palm inside my pocket. The air in my lungs turned to ash. I looked at the side of her face. The perfect makeup, the complete and utter lack of interest in my survival. In that freezing, beautifully lit kitchen, the last desperate piece of my childhood died. I understood, completely and permanently, that nothing I built would ever register in this house. I could cure a terminal disease, and my mother would only ask if Elena had cured it first. I slowly pulled my hand out of my pocket. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. The sadness evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard armor. "Chicago," I said, my voice completely hollow. "That's great for her." I turned around and walked out the back door, stepping into the biting wind. I made a silent vow to myself as I walked back to the hidden cottage. I would never ever speak of my business to them again. Not until I was too massive for them to ignore. Not until I held the very ground they walked on. The sudden violent vibration of my cell phone against the cheap wooden nightstand sounded like a buzzsaw in the dead quiet of the cottage. I jolted awake, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. It was 11:42 p.m. Beside me, Chloe shifted under the wool blanket, letting out a soft sigh, but she didn't wake. I stared at the glowing screen in the dark, an unknown number with a 503 area code. My mind immediately raced to the worst-case scenarios, a professional habit I was already developing. Was it a burst pipe at one of the new properties? A triggered security alarm? Or worse, was it my father, calling from a different line to tell me he knew exactly what I was hiding? I snatched the phone and slipped out of the bed, my bare feet hitting the freezing floorboards. I walked into the tiny kitchenette, wrapping my arms around myself, and answered. "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper. "Hi, Claire," a woman's voice said. It was calm, steady, and entirely unfamiliar. "I'm Eleanor. I'm your father's sister. And I think we need to talk." I almost dropped the phone. The breath left my lungs in a rush. In the Donovan family, Eleanor Sterling was a ghost. She was a name you absolutely did not say out loud. In my father's strict, carefully controlled version of reality, he didn't even have a sister anymore. 12 years ago, Eleanor had divorced her husband. In a town like Crestwood, where the country club wives traded gossip like currency and separated couples moved to different counties to hide their shame, Eleanor did the unthinkable. She stayed. She opened an antique shop on Elm Street, lived alone, and actually liked it. Harrison immediately cut her off. He told Elena and me that she was a disgrace, an infection that needed to be burned out of the family tree. I hadn't seen her face since I was 20. "Aunt Eleanor?" I breathed, checking the dark window to make sure nobody was walking up the gravel path. I heard about you from a mutual client, she said smoothly, ignoring my shock. I'll see you at my shop, tomorrow, after you drop Chloe at school. Don't park out front. Click. The line went dead. The next morning it was pouring rain. I parked 3 blocks away and walked to Elm Street, pulling my coat tight against the chill. The bell above the door chimed a sharp, bright note as I stepped inside. The shop smelled like rich cedar, lemon oil, and old decaying paper. It was a maze of towering bookshelves, covered mirrors, and dozens of ticking grandfather clocks. Eleanor emerged from the shadows in the back. She didn't look like a disgrace. She looked sharp. Her hair was a sleek silver, and her dark eyes locked onto mine, scanning me from head to toe. She noticed the dark circles under my eyes. She noticed my rough, calloused hands. "You look exhausted, Claire," she said quietly, setting down a polishing cloth. "But you don't look broken. How do you know about my business?" I asked, my voice tight with defense. I was ready to bolt. If Harrison found out I was standing here, the fallout would be catastrophic. Eleanor walked behind a glass display counter. "Mrs. Gable, the woman whose lake house you manage. She came in yesterday looking for a vintage mirror, and couldn't stop talking about the brilliant, invisible young woman who saved her pipes from bursting during the big freeze last month. She said you were at the house at 2 a.m. with a blowtorch and a plumber. Small towns, Claire. Everyone knows someone who knows someone." I swallowed hard, my professional instinct fighting my rising panic. "Please don't tell him." "Tell him?" Eleanor let out a short, bitter laugh. "I wouldn't cross the street to tell my brother his own house was on fire." She reached under the counter and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She slid it across the glass. It stopped right in front of my hands. "I want to invest in your company," she said, her voice dropping lower, vibrating with absolute seriousness. $25,000. Not a loan. Equity. I stared at the envelope. My brain stopped working. $25,000 was more than I had made scrubbing floors in the last 4 months combined. It was a lifeline. It was a weapon. In my family, money was always a leash. Harrison used his wallet to control us, to buy Elena's loyalty, to punish my independence. I looked up at her, my eyes narrowing. "I don't understand. Why? Is this just to spite him?" Eleanor leaned forward, planting her hands on the glass. Her gaze pierced right through my armor. "No, I'm doing this because I've looked into your business model, and it is bulletproof. You saw a gap in the market, and you attacked it." She paused, her expression softening just a fraction. "And frankly, because somebody should have believed in you a long time ago. I know exactly what it feels like to be erased from this family for choosing to survive on your own terms. Sound familiar?" A hot tear spilled over my eyelid before I could stop it. I wiped it away furiously, embarrassed by my own vulnerability. But I took the envelope. It felt incredibly heavy in my hands. That money changed everything. But more importantly, Eleanor's antique shop became my fortress. It became the official corporate address for Juniper Property Management. Any legal documents, bank statements, or vendor contracts went directly to her shop, safely hidden behind a wall of ticking clocks, light years away from my father's prying eyes. Within weeks I hired 2 part-time employees. I bought a dark blue unmarked work van, which I strictly parked in the alley behind Eleanor's shop, never at the cottage. I finally stopped scrambling as a one-woman show and started running operations like a true CEO. One evening, as I was packing up my laptop in the back of the shop, Eleanor handed me a cup of tea. She watched me for a long moment, the ticking of the clocks suddenly feeling very loud in the quiet room. "Family should be a safe place, Claire," she said softly, "not a cage." I nodded, zipping my bag. "I'm getting us out of that cage, Eleanor. Soon." She took a slow sip of her tea, her dark eyes flashing with something cold and deeply hidden. "Good," she whispered, "because there is something I know about your father that you don't. A very old crack in his perfect foundation." I froze, the zipper slipping from my fingers. "What do you mean?" Eleanor just shook her head, turning back to the shadows of the shop. "Not yet. Keep building your empire, Claire. When the time is right, the truth will do the rest." 3 years. That is exactly how long the quiet lasted. It was a fragile, breathless kind of quiet, like the heavy stillness before a storm finally breaks. By the time I turned 30, my secret life had grown teeth. Juniper was no longer just a laptop and a P.O. box. I had 7 employees on payroll, 10 massive luxury properties under ironclad contracts. My company van, parked safely in the alley behind Eleanor's shop, carried the pale gray and blue Juniper logo that my daughter Chloe had helped me pick out. But every evening at 5:30 p.m., The CEO of Juniper Management drove her beat-up sedan back to the gravel driveway of her father's estate. I walked past the giant, shadowing pines, stepped into the drafty 400-square-foot cottage, and turned back into Claire, the girl who cleaned houses. I was hoarding my capital, building an invisible fortress of cash, waiting for the right moment to escape. Then Harrison decided it was time to remind me exactly who owned the ground I walked on. It happened on a cold Saturday in November. It was a rare private family dinner in the main house. No audience, just meatloaf, heavy mashed potatoes, and the suffocating pressure of my father's dining room. The room smelled of dark gravy and lemon polish. Elena sat across from me. Her husband Marcus sat beside her, staring blankly at his water glass. The silence between them was thick and uncomfortable, a silent alarm I noted but couldn't afford to fix. Chloe sat in the corner, happily dragging a green crayon across a piece of paper. The only sounds were the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway and the sharp clink of Harrison's silver fork against his china plate. Halfway through the meal, Harrison set his fork down. The sound was deliberate. It was a gavel striking wood. "That 50-acre parcel out back is worth something real now," he said. His voice was casual, almost bored, like he was commenting on the frost on the windows. I stopped chewing. I kept my eyes on my plate. "I'm talking to developers," he continued smoothly, taking a slow sip of his wine. "I might need to rearrange things. Rearrange things." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp as icicles. I looked up, the muscles in my neck pulled tight. Rearrange things? How? Harrison didn't look at me. He just wiped his mouth with his linen napkin. "Don't worry about it. Just know that nothing is permanent." The room went completely dead. Elena stopped breathing, her eyes locked onto the table. Marcus took a long, slow drink of water, desperately avoiding the crossfire. Margaret quickly busied herself, aggressively twisting the salt shaker. Nobody said a single word in my defense. In this house, when Harrison made a statement, it wasn't a conversation, it was a verdict. Later that night, long after I had tucked Chloe into her bed on the floor of the cottage, my phone buzzed in the dark. It was Margaret. Her voice was strained, caught halfway between a nervous apology and a strict instruction. "Someone came to look at the property last week, Claire," she whispered into the phone. "A developer?" My stomach dropped like a stone. I pulled my knees to my chest in the dark room. "What developer, Mom? I don't know the details. You know your father handles these things. They've only looked at the drone footage and the boundary maps so far." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "It's probably nothing. I shouldn't have even mentioned it." Click. The line went dead. I sat on the edge of the mattress, listening to the wind rattle the single-pane glass. The floorboards beneath my feet felt incredibly thin. As a property manager, I knew exactly what drone footage and boundary maps meant. It wasn't a casual thought. It was phase one of a commercial sale. The ground beneath my life was actively being sold. Panic, cold and metallic, flooded my veins. I opened my laptop and started searching for rentals. I needed something near Chloe's elementary school. I needed a 3-bedroom apartment that wouldn't drain Juniper's emergency operational reserves. But the trap of Crestwood was its size. It was a wealthy, gated bubble. Affordable housing simply didn't exist near the good schools. The few places that were available cost twice what I could safely swing without putting my business at risk. I made one phone call to a local realtor, just one. In a town this size, that was a fatal mistake. The realtor was the daughter of one of Margaret's country club friends. Less than a week later, my phone rang at 9 a.m. "You're looking at apartments?" Margaret's voice was high, shaking with a manufactured, theatrical panic. "Claire, you're going to take Chloe away from us." "Mom, I'm not taking anyone away. I need a secure roof. Your father will be devastated," she interrupted, her tone sharpening into a weapon. "After everything we've done for you. After he put a roof over your head." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask what exactly they had done besides charge me my dignity for a freezing room with no lease. But I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. That evening, the final blow came. Harrison called. No greeting. No preamble. "You move out, you're on your own completely." His voice was flat, totally devoid of emotion. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. "Are you serious?" "I'm being practical," he said smoothly. "If you leave this property, don't expect us to babysit Chloe on weekends. Don't expect Christmas invitations. You want to be independent? You pay the full price." He knew exactly where the knife would hurt the most, and he twisted it without blinking. Chloe called my parents every single night before bed. She drew pictures of her grandfather's prized rose garden. She counted the days on her calendar between Sunday visits to the main house. Cutting that connection wasn't something I could do to a 9-year-old girl who had already lost her father. Harrison knew that. He was using my daughter's love as a padlock to keep me in my place. I closed my eyes in the dark cottage. I assessed the threat with the cold, calculated mind of a CEO facing a hostile takeover. If I left now, out of anger, I would burn through my business capital and break my daughter's heart in the process. It was a bad trade. So, I stopped looking for apartments. I unpacked my bags. I wasn't staying because I was weak. I was staying because leaving at the wrong time would have cost me the war. I needed to build my empire larger. I needed to become so incredibly powerful that when I finally walked out of those trees, I wouldn't need a single thing from him ever again. That day wasn't here yet. But as I listened to the winter wind howl against the cottage walls, I knew it was coming. The cracks in my armor didn't show on me first. They showed on Chloe. It started with a voicemail on a damp Thursday afternoon. It was Mrs. Higgins, Chloe's third-grade teacher, asking me to come in after the bell. I sat in a tiny bright blue plastic chair in the empty classroom, my knees practically touching my chin. The room smelled of floor wax and pencil shavings. Mrs. Higgins, a kind woman with tired eyes and 25 years of experience, folded her hands on her desk. She didn't look at me right away. "Chloe has been very quiet at lunch this week," she began carefully. She rearranged a stack of spelling tests, searching for the right words. "Yesterday, some of the kids were talking about what their parents do for work. Doctors, lawyers, mechanics. When it was Chloe's turn, they asked her what you did." My chest tightened. The small plastic chair suddenly felt like a trap. "What did she say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Higgins finally looked up, her expression full of quiet pity. "She didn't answer, Claire. She just turned red, shrugged her shoulders, and looked at the floor. Another child pointed out that they saw you pushing a mop bucket at the country club." I stopped breathing. The floor wax smell suddenly made me sick. My 9-year-old daughter was already learning how to carry the weight of my family's shame. That night, the wind howled around the cottage, rattling the thin glass. I tucked the wool blanket tightly around Chloe's shoulders. Her small face was pale in the dim light of the bedside lamp. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly in the cold room. "Do you like your job?" I smoothed her dark hair back from her forehead. "I love my job, baby. Very much." Chloe stared up at the ceiling, her tiny brow furrowed. "Then why does Grandpa always say it funny? Like it's a bad word?" I kissed her forehead, my lips lingering against her warm skin, and reached over to click off the lamp. "Sleep now, sweetie," I managed to say. I walked into the tiny kitchenette, sitting alone in the pitch black. The silence in the cottage was deafening. I stared at the dark wall for a full hour. The cold seeped into my bones, but I barely felt it. A new terrifying realization clicked into place in my mind, locking like a deadbolt. This wasn't just about me surviving anymore. Harrison's cruel jokes, his little performances at the dining room table, they weren't just bouncing off my armor, they were seeping straight into my daughter's bones. She was 9, and she was already being taught that her mother wasn't worth being proud of. That same week, a massive opportunity landed in my hidden business email. I was scanning local commercial real estate filings at 2 a.m. when I saw it. A new luxury development was breaking ground in the valley. 15 sprawling vacation homes. The owner was searching for a single full-service firm to manage everything: HVAC, groundskeeping, guest turnover, emergency vendors. My eyes darted across the glowing screen, doing the math instantly. Managing a portfolio this massive would generate an annual revenue of over $450,000 just in management fees. It was enough money to double Juniper's size in a month. It was enough to hire a full executive team. It was enough to pack our bags and leave this freezing cottage for good. My hands shook as I picked up my phone. I dialed Eleanor's number, not caring that it was the middle of the night. She picked up on the second ring, wide awake. "I found the exit door," I whispered into the phone, the words tumbling out in a rush. I told her about the development, the money, and then, my voice breaking, I told her about Chloe in the lunchroom. Eleanor was silent for a long, heavy moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steel. "Fear is a landlord too, Claire, and the rent just keeps going up. Make the call." The next morning, I locked myself in my van in the alley behind the antique shop. I pulled up the developer's contact info. Thorn Development Group. I took a deep, shuddering breath, staring at the number. Then, I hit dial. 3 rings. Every second stretched like a rubber band about to snap. A voice answered. It was steady, professional, and entirely unhurried. The voice of a man who owned everything he looked at. Victor Thorne. What can I do for you? I didn't pitch as Claire, the maid from Crestwood. I squared my shoulders in the empty van, dropping my voice an octave, and pitched as the CEO of Juniper Property Management. I spoke about asset protection, vendor consolidation, and preventative maintenance schedules. Victor Thorne didn't say yes on that first call. The line was quiet for a terrifying 3 seconds. Send me your portfolio and your risk mitigation strategies, he finally said. By 5 o'clock today. I spent the next 6 hours fighting for my life. I compiled every property photo, every glowing client reference, and every emergency maintenance report I had ever filed. I formatted the 50-page dossier like a woman who had a massive point to prove. Because I did. 4 agonizing days later, my phone rang. I asked around the valley. Victor's deep voice came through the speaker. 3 different property owners told me the exact same thing. They said if you want a problem actually solved, you call Juniper. A brief pause. Come to my corporate office in Eugene on Tuesday. Let's see if you're the real deal. On Tuesday morning, I drove 2 hours out of Crestwood. I wore the only professional black blazer I owned. Victor's office was a sprawling fortress of glass, steel, and high-end art. It was a world away from the rotting wood of my father's cottage. Victor Thorne stood up from behind his massive oak desk. He was tall, imposing, with sharp calculating eyes that immediately scanned my face. He shook my hand firmly. He didn't see a maid. He saw a peer. Your logistics are flawless, Claire, Victor said, sliding a thick legal document across the desk. You understand how to protect an investment. Let's do this. I clicked my pen and signed my name on a 3-year management contract. Just like that, Juniper evolved from a local hustle into a regional powerhouse. We established standing video calls every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Within a week, I hired 5 new employees. The empire was finally taking shape. But as I drove back into Crestwood that Friday, the sky turned a bruised, ugly purple. I turned my beat-up sedan onto my father's gravel driveway. The massive pine trees cast long, dark shadows over the cottage. The lock clicked behind me as I stepped inside. The air was freezing. My phone immediately vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from Harrison. Come to my study. Now. The other shoe hadn't just dropped. It was about to kick the door in. The walk from the cottage to the main house felt like walking to an execution. The wind whipped through the towering Douglas firs, violently thrashing the branches. I pulled my coat tighter, feeling the lingering ghost of the CEO I had been just hours ago in Eugene fighting against the frightened daughter I was expected to be here. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the main house. The hallway was dead silent. I walked slowly down the corridor, the floorboards creaking under my boots, until I reached the closed double doors of Harrison's study. I didn't knock. I just turned the brass handle and walked in. The room smelled thick and suffocating, a mix of sweet pipe tobacco, lemon polish, and old expensive leather. It was a room designed to make whoever stood on the opposite side of the desk feel small. Harrison sat in his high-backed leather chair, bathed in the sharp yellow glow of a brass reading lamp. He didn't look up immediately. He let me stand there, letting the silence stretch, establishing his authority. Finally, he closed his fountain pen with a sharp click. He slid a stark white document across the dark mahogany wood. I need you to sign these papers, he said. His voice was completely devoid of inflection. I stepped closer, my eyes darting to the bold black letters at the top of the page. What papers? Exactly. An agreement that you'll vacate the cottage by January 15th. My breath caught. I stared down at the date printed in aggressive, heavy ink. January? That's barely 2 months away. Right after the holidays. In the dead of winter. Why the rush? Harrison leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his chest. His eyes were flat, unapologetic. Because it is my property, Claire. That's why. The buyer's environmental surveyors are coming the 3rd week of January to walk the acreage. I need the cottage completely empty, boarded up and looking abandoned before they start poking around the tree line. I didn't yell. The urge to cry had burned out of me years ago. Instead, the analytical, survival-driven part of my brain took over. I leaned over the desk, reading the fine print upside down. My eyes locked onto the letterhead. It was a massive commercial real estate law firm based in Seattle. This wasn't a local transaction. This was a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. He was hiding a massive sale, and my existence on the property was a liability to his payday. I stood up straight. My hands were perfectly steady. I'm not signing anything tonight, I said quietly. I'll read it first. Harrison's jaw tightened. A flash of genuine anger broke through his controlled mask. "You'll sign it, Claire, or I'll have the sheriff remove you as a trespasser." "Have your lawyer call me," I replied, turning my back on him. I walked out, the heavy doors shutting behind me with a solid, echoing thud. My hands were steady, but inside my chest, my heart was hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. Margaret's approach was always softer, and because it was softer, it was infinitely more dangerous. She summoned me for tea the next morning in the sunlit breakfast nook. Steam rose from delicate bone china cups. Margaret looked pale, her eyes damp and rimmed with red, but her posture was rigid. "Your father is under a tremendous amount of stress right now, Claire," she began, her voice quivering with carefully rehearsed fragility. She stirred her tea, the silver spoon clinking sharply against the porcelain. "His investments haven't been doing well. The market shifted. He needs to sell that 50-acre parcel to keep things afloat." "Then why didn't he just talk to me like a human being?" I asked, keeping my hands firmly in my lap. "Why hand me legal eviction papers in the middle of the night?" "We are talking now," she insisted, leaning forward, her eyes pleading. "You're just not listening. You always make things so difficult." I stared at her. "You are asking me to pack up my 9-year-old daughter and force her out of her home in the dead of winter, without even telling me why until I saw a lawyer's letterhead." Margaret's soft, weeping expression abruptly vanished. The fragility evaporated, leaving behind something cold, brittle, and deeply cruel. She set her cup down. "Elena would never make things this difficult for us," she stated. "Elena doesn't live in a freezing, uninsulated cottage hidden in the woods on Dad's land." I fired back. "Exactly." Margaret looked straight into my eyes, her gaze completely unblinking. "Because Elena made something of herself." The words landed like a physical slap across the face. The silence in the sunroom became absolute. It wasn't just the cruelty of the statement, it was the utter, undeniable truth of how my mother viewed my existence. I wasn't a person to her. I was a failure that needed to be swept off the property before the real guests arrived. I stood up slowly. I didn't touch the tea. "Good luck with the sale, Mom." I closed the glass door behind me. The click of the latch felt louder than a gunshot. That night I sat alone on the rotting wooden steps of the cottage porch, staring into the dark tree line. The cold bit through my sweater. My phone suddenly vibrated against my thigh. I pulled it out, expecting a threatening text from Harrison. Instead, I saw a name that made my blood run cold. "Elena." The text was brief. "Can we talk privately?" "Oak Ridge." My sister had not texted me directly in over 2 years. We met the next afternoon at a small anonymous coffee shop in Oak Ridge, 30 minutes away from Crestwood's whispering circles. It was raining heavily, the water blurring the windows. When Elena walked through the door, I barely recognized her. The golden daughter, the confident, untouchable doctor I had grown up envying, was gone. Her posture had completely caved in. The expensive tailored coat hung loosely on her frame. She looked hollowed out, reduced to a ghost. She sat down across from me and ordered a black coffee. She didn't take off her coat. For a full, agonizing minute, neither of us spoke. The hiss of the espresso machine filled the silence. Then she stared down at her trembling hands and said it. "Marcus wants a divorce." I blinked, the shock momentarily overriding my defenses. "Since when?" "Since August," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We've been pretending for 5 months. We sleep in different bedrooms. We barely look at each other." "Elena, why are you telling me this? Why not Mom and Dad?" She finally looked up. Her eyes were terrified, completely stripped of their usual arrogance. "Because you're the only person in this family who actually knows what it's like to start over. You're the only one who knows how to survive them." The rawness of the admission hit me square in the chest. Another heavy silence stretched between us. She gripped her coffee cup like it was a lifeline. "I know they treat you differently, Claire," she whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing down her pale cheek. "They always have. I never said anything at the dinner table. I just let him do it. I should have defended you. I didn't want an apology for the past. I needed to assess the present." "How much debt are you carrying, Elena?" I asked, my voice dropping into my calm, detached CEO tone. She flinched as if I had struck her. $210,000 in federal loans. Marcus managed all the payments from his accounts. If we split, I have no savings. The lifestyle, the house, it's all leveraged. If he leaves, I am completely ruined." She trailed off, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. I sat there, listening to the rain hit the glass. The illusion of the golden child was completely shattered, leaving behind a terrified, drowning woman. She wiped her eyes, looking at me with absolute desperation. "Do you know a good divorce lawyer?" I reached into my purse, pulled out a pen, and wrote a name and a private number on a napkin. I slid it across the table. For a fleeting second, as she stared at the ink, she looked exactly like the scared, overwhelmed 20-year-old girl I remembered from our childhood. The perfect family was burning to the ground from the inside out, and I was the only one standing near the exit. 4 months before Christmas, the shadow empire I had built finally broke into the light. Juniper Property Management had evolved from a desperate midnight hustle into a relentless machine. I now had 14 full-time employees. We managed 18 high-net-worth luxury properties across the Willamette Valley. My company was overseeing a real estate portfolio valued at over $45 million, generating a gross annual rental revenue of $4.8 million. I was running a massive, highly synchronized operation with scheduling software, uniformed maintenance crews, and corporate accounts. I had an office in Oak Ridge with glass walls and a team that answered to me. But every evening I still drove my beat-up sedan back to the Crestwood estate. To my parents, I was still just Claire, the girl who cleaned houses. The ghost. Then the outside world finally knocked. A journalist named Megan from the Willamette Business Review called my direct line. "Hi, Miss Donovan. We're doing a cover feature on the top local entrepreneurs under 40. Your name came up 3 separate times from different luxury developers in the valley. They all said you're the one pulling the strings behind the curtain." I sat in my leather chair, staring out the glass window of my Oak Ridge office. My heart gave a heavy rhythmic thud. I agreed to the interview, but I set a hard, non-negotiable boundary. "I'll do the piece," I told her, my voice strictly professional, "but under one condition. You do not mention my family, my parents, or my personal background in Crestwood. Focus strictly on the logistics, the numbers, and the business." Megan agreed. She spent 3 grueling hours with me in my Oak Ridge headquarters. She watched me command a room of contractors. She treated me like a brilliant CEO, because that is exactly what I was. As she packed up her recorder, Megan smiled. "This issue is going to be our biggest of the year. It publishes the week of Christmas. You'll get an advance copy delivered." I didn't tell my parents. The only person I called was Eleanor. I stood in the alley behind my office, the autumn wind biting at my face, and relayed the conversation. Eleanor let out a low, rich laugh that crackled over the phone line. "Well," she murmured, the sound of ticking clocks echoing behind her, "that is going to make for a very interesting holiday dinner." 3 weeks before Christmas, the first domino fell. I was standing in the sprawling, overheated kitchen of the main house, helping Margaret sort through her thick stack of embossed Christmas dinner RSVPs. Outside, frost clung to the window panes. The heavy kitchen doors swung open. Harrison walked in. He wasn't walking, he was prowling. He held his phone in his hand like he had just won a war, his chest puffed out, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Guess who is coming to Christmas dinner?" he announced. Margaret looked up from her silver RSVP tray, adjusting her reading glasses. "Who, Harrison?" "The mayor." "Better," Harrison said. He poured himself a glass of scotch, the ice clinking loudly in the quiet room. He took a sip, savoring the moment. "Victor Thorne." I was holding a heavy silver serving spoon. My fingers went completely numb. "Owner of Thorne Development Group," Harrison continued, his voice echoing off the marble countertops, oblivious to the fact that I had completely stopped breathing. "The biggest residential developer in the valley. I've been circling him for 6 months to finalize the sale of the 50-acre parcel out back. This is my shot. He's only seen the aerial drone shots of the land so far. Once I get him at the head of my table, pour him my best wine, and impress him personally, by New Year's the deal is signed and his surveyors come in." My blood turned to ice water. Victor Thorne, the man I had a standing, high-level executive video call with every single Wednesday at 10 a.m. The man whose multi-million-dollar properties I actively managed. My father had never once asked the name of my cleaning company. He didn't know I operated out of Oak Ridge. And Victor Thorne had no earthly reason to know that his ruthless, efficient property manager's maiden name was tied to this specific Crestwood estate. He definitely didn't know that the woman who ran Juniper Property Management went home at night to a freezing 400-square-foot rotting cottage hidden in the trees directly behind the land he was about to buy. 2 entirely separate, massively powerful worlds were about to violently collide at a dining room table in exactly 21 days. I carefully set the silver spoon down. It made no sound. "Excuse me," I whispered to Margaret, who didn't even look up. I walked out the back door, practically running through the freezing snow to the cottage. I locked the door, pulled all the blinds shut, and called Eleanor, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the phone twice. "Victor Thorne is coming to Christmas dinner," I gasped when she answered. Dad invited him. He's the one buying the land. Eleanor exhaled slowly. The ticking clocks in her shop sounded like a countdown bomb. What do? I asked, pacing the narrow floorboards, the panic clawing at my throat. Do I cancel his contract? Do I warn him? You do absolutely nothing, Claire, Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a deadly calm whisper. You hold your ground. The truth always has a way of showing up on its own, and I have my own special plans for Christmas this year. The Tuesday before Christmas, the trap snapped shut. My phone buzzed. Study. Now. I walked into Harrison's office. This time he didn't even offer the illusion of a conversation. A stark notarized legal document sat in the absolute center of his desk. Sign this by Christmas Eve, Harrison commanded. After that, I'm involving the sheriff to drag your belongings to the curb. I stepped up to the mahogany desk. I didn't reach for the pen. I picked up the heavy cream-colored paper. I read the move-out terms. I read the waiver of claims to the property. And then, buried at the bottom of the second page, I saw the hard numbers. The sale price, $550,000. The CEO inside me instantly recognized the fatal, arrogant mistake my father had just made. I looked up slowly. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. You told Victor Thorne the cottage was entirely empty, didn't you? I asked. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Harrison's eyes narrowed. It will be empty, because I'm making a multi-million-dollar business decision, and you are in the way. You lied on a commercial real estate disclosure form, I stated evenly, watching his face. You told a buyer the land was vacant and unencumbered while your daughter and granddaughter were living on it. I'm not discussing real estate law with a maid, he spat, his face flushing dark red. Sign the paper. I set the document gently back onto the desk. I smoothed the crease with my thumb. I'm not the one making this hard, Dad, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the desperate, prideful man hiding behind the expensive suit. I turned and walked out of the study. I didn't run. I walked back to the cottage, picked up my phone and called my corporate lawyer. Then I called Eleanor. Christmas was in 6 days. The grenade was primed, the pin was pulled, and for the first time in 7 long years I wasn't terrified of the explosion. I was ready for it. Christmas morning smelled like roasting rosemary, burning firewood, and impending collapse. I was in the sprawling kitchen of the main house by 10 a.m., my hair pulled back tightly, a plain white apron tied around my waist. The heat from the double ovens was suffocating. I had dressed Chloe in a thick green corduroy dress, keeping her tucked in the corner with a coloring book, out of the crossfire. At 1 p.m., Elena arrived. Marcus trailed 3 feet behind her, his face a mask of pale, silent endurance. They didn't touch. They barely spoke. The guests began to trickle in shortly after. Aunt Barbara, Uncle Tom, the Millers, Reverend Thomas, and Cousin Greg. The house filled with the loud, hollow sounds of forced holiday cheer. And then, exactly at 1:30 p.m., the heavy crunch of tires on gravel silenced the front room. A gleaming black SUV pulled up to the grand entrance. Victor Thorne had arrived. Harrison practically sprinted to the front door, throwing it open with a wide, desperate smile. Victor, Cynthia, welcome to our home. Victor stepped into the foyer, brushing the snow from his dark, tailored wool coat. He was polite, intensely composed, and radiated the quiet, dangerous authority of a man who owned everything he surveyed. He shook Harrison's hand, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the architecture, the guests, the power dynamics of the room, and then, he looked past Harrison's shoulder. He looked straight through the dining room and into the kitchen doorway. He saw me. I was standing there, a silver serving tray in my hands, wearing an apron, sweat dampening my temples. For one split second, the impenetrable mask of Victor Thorne slipped. His eyes widened just a fraction. I saw the breath literally catch in his throat. He opened his mouth. Claire? His expression said. But before the word could form, Margaret swooped into his line of sight like a hawk. Oh, don't mind the mess in there. She laughed nervously, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. That's just Claire, our younger daughter. She helps around the house. The help, really. Victor slowly closed his mouth. He looked at Margaret, his eyes turning to cold steel, and then he looked back at me. I gave him a single, barely perceptible shake of my head. Victor Thorne was a predator in boardrooms. He read people for a living. He instantly recognized the apron, the dismissal, the heavy, arrogant blindness of the man trying to sell him a multi-million-dollar subdivision. Victor's jaw tightened. He chose absolute silence. He gave me a microscopic nod, buttoned his suit jacket, and allowed Harrison to lead him into the living room, carefully steering him away from the windows that faced the hidden occupied cottage in the woods. Dinner commenced at 3 p.m. 18 people sat around the massive candlelit mahogany table. The crystal glasses gleamed. Victor sat 3 chairs to my right. Chloe sat perfectly still beside me, her small hand clutching my knee under the table. As the first course was cleared, Harrison stood up at the head of the table. He picked up his heavy crystal glass and tapped it with a silver knife. Clink, clink, clink. The room fell dead silent. "I want to give thanks," Harrison's voice boomed, rich and theatrical, "for this beautiful home, for our friends, and especially for my brilliant Elena, Dr. Elena Donovan Vance, who makes this family so incredibly proud." Polite, warm applause filled the room. Elena smiled, but it was brittle, her eyes hollow. Beside her, Marcus stared blankly at his plate. Harrison wasn't done. He never was. He let the applause die down, then turned his body slightly, his eyes finding mine at the far end of the table. A cruel, practiced smirk touched his lips. "And of course we give thanks for Claire." He paused, letting the heavy, uncomfortable beat land right on my chest. "One daughter is a doctor, and the other one is a maid." He laughed. It was a loud, booming sound. Aunt Barbara chuckled. Cousin Greg smirked. A few others joined in, eager to please the host. The blood drained entirely from my face. Beside me, Cynthia Thorne shifted uncomfortably in her seat. But Victor didn't laugh. His jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. He stared directly at my father with a gaze so intensely cold it could have frozen the wine in the glasses. And then, in the suffocating quiet that followed the laughter, a small trembling voice broke the silence. "Mommy." Every eye snapped to Chloe. She was looking up at me, her large eyes filled with genuine confusion and rising fear. "Mommy, why does Grandpa always say you're just a maid? Is being a maid a bad thing?" The table completely froze. Not a single fork moved. Nobody breathed. Margaret's face paled. "Chloe, honey," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Grandpa was just making a joke." I looked down at my daughter's terrified, innocent face. I felt the 7 years of shame, the freezing nights on the floorboards, the bleeding hands, the forced invisibility, all of it crystallized into a diamond-hard point of absolute rage. I looked at Victor Thorne, who was watching me with dark, expectant eyes, waiting for me to pull the pin on the grenade. I stood up. The heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I placed my hand gently on Chloe's shoulder. "Chloe," my voice rang out, shockingly steady, cutting through the dead air of the dining room. "Being a maid is not bad. Honest work is never bad. But since your grandfather brought it up in front of all his friends, let me tell you what Mommy actually does." Harrison's smug smile instantly vanished. The color drained from his face. "Claire, sit down immediately. You are making a scene." "You made the scene, Dad," I replied, my voice dropping into the cold, calculated tone of a CEO executing a hostile takeover. "You stood up in front of 18 people and tried to define my life. Now I will define myself." The room was utterly airless. "I started by cleaning toilets in this town to keep a roof over my child's head," I said, my eyes locking onto his. "I am not ashamed of that. But I didn't stop there. 7 years ago I built a company. It's called Juniper Property Management." Harrison blinked, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "We operate out of Oak Ridge," I continued, projecting my voice so every single person at the table heard the exact numbers. "I am the CEO. I manage a real estate portfolio valued at over $45 million across the Willamette Valley. I employ 14 full-time staff. And last year my firm generated $4.8 million in gross rental revenue. Nothing. No sound. No movement. It was as if time had literally stopped." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Claire, what? Why are you lying?" Then, Victor Thorne moved. He reached out and deliberately set his crystal water glass onto the mahogany. The heavy thud resonated through the wood. He stood up. He didn't rush. He rose with the overwhelming, crushing gravity of a man preparing to execute a traitor. He dropped the polite dinner guest facade entirely. "Claire Donovan," Victor's deep voice boomed, filling the room. Every terrified eye snapped toward him. "You are the CEO of Juniper." "Yes, Mr. Thorne," I replied smoothly, holding his gaze. Victor turned his head slowly toward my father. "Harrison, you did not tell me your daughter runs Juniper Management." My father's mouth opened, but only a dry, pathetic wheeze came out. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Victor repeated, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet whisper. Harrison, last Wednesday in my office, you told me your younger daughter was an unfortunate burden. You told me she was between jobs. Aunt Barbara let out a shocked whimper. You invited me into your home, Victor continued, his disgust vibrating in the air. You introduced your own flesh and blood as the hired help, and the entire time, she is the primary operational executive holding the keys to my entire regional investment portfolio. Chloe tugged softly on my apron string. Mommy, is that the man from your Wednesday video calls? Yes, baby, I said, never taking my eyes off Harrison. That's him. Just then, the heavy brass doorbell rang. Margaret, physically shaking, stumbled backward and pulled the front door open. Eleanor Sterling stepped into the foyer. She wore a striking crimson coat. In one hand she held a bottle of expensive wine. In the other a glossy, freshly printed magazine. Because my corporate mail went to her antique shop, the advance copies of the Willamette Business Review had been delivered to her hands just 3 hours ago. She knew Victor was here. She knew exactly what time the bomb was set to detonate. Eleanor? Harrison choked out, his eyes wide with rising terror. What are you doing in my house? I brought a gift for my niece, Eleanor said smoothly, her heels clicking loudly on the hardwood as she walked straight to the dining table. She didn't look at Harrison. She looked at me, smiled, and laid the magazine perfectly flat on the white tablecloth under the chandelier. The bold black headlines screamed up at the room. Juniper Property Management. How a single mom built a regional empire from scratch. Cynthia Thorne reached out and picked it up. She looked at the full-page, professional photograph of me standing in my corporate office, then looked at me standing in the kitchen apron. Harrison stared at the magazine cover. His carefully constructed, decades-long empire of lies was disintegrating before his eyes. Eleanor finally turned to her brother. Her voice was pure ice. You have been so incredibly busy being ashamed of her, Harrison, that you completely missed what she became. Victor buttoned his jacket. The dinner was over. The execution was beginning. Harrison, Victor said, his tone entirely devoid of mercy. The 50-acre parcel you are desperately trying to sell me. My environmental surveyors are scheduled for January 15th. Victor's eyes narrowed into slits. Does your daughter live in the cottage on the far edge of that property line? Harrison swallowed, sweat beading on his forehead. Victor, that is a separate private family matter. It became my business, Victor snarled, stepping forward. The exact moment you lied on a commercial real estate disclosure form. You legally documented that the land was vacant and unencumbered to secure my $550,000 offer, while actively plotting to illegally evict your own daughter to hide the evidence. I stepped out from behind my chair. I saw the contract on his desk last week, Victor. He handed me an eviction notice and demanded I sign it by tonight. He told you the cottage was empty to close the deal. Victor stood perfectly still, his eyes boring into my father. Fraud. You attempted to commit commercial real estate fraud, Harrison. If my surveyors had walked that land and found an occupied dwelling, my legal team would have dismantled you. I don't do business with liars, and I certainly don't buy stolen ground. Victor, please, let's step into my study, Harrison begged, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of his power. We can negotiate. We have nothing to negotiate. Victor turned to me, his cold expression instantly shifting into professional respect. He gave me a deep, deliberate nod. Claire, I will see you on our video call on Wednesday. Outstanding work. Thank you, Victor. Victor placed his hand on his wife's back, and together, they walked out the front door. The heavy oak slammed shut behind them, sealing my father's fate. Within 10 minutes, the table was deserted. Guests scrambled for their coats, unable to look Harrison in the eye. The $550,000 deal was dead. His reputation in Crestwood was shattered permanently. The police wouldn't need to be called. The social and financial death sentence Victor Thorne had just handed down was far more severe. I untied the apron from my waist and let it drop onto the floor. I picked up Chloe. I walked to the head of the table where Harrison was slumped in his chair, staring at the empty plates. I'll have my things out of the cottage by tomorrow morning, I said quietly. Not because you threatened me. Because I should have left a long time ago. I don't need your roof anymore. Claire. His voice was a broken, pathetic whisper. I'm not angry, Dad, I said, and for the first time in my life it was entirely true. The cold numbness had washed over me, leaving nothing but peace. I'm just completely done waiting for you to see me. I looked across the room at Elena. She was standing by the door holding her coat. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face, and gave a sharp, definitive nod. She was leaving Marcus. She was leaving the illusion. I walked out the front door into the freezing snow. Eleanor was waiting on the porch, her breath pluming in the cold air. My living room is big enough for the two of you tonight, she said softly. By Sunday the story had violently torn through Crestwood. the Willamette Business Review hit the newsstands. Reverend Thomas quietly asked Harrison to step down from the church committee. Margaret's auxiliary group stopped returning her calls. The silence they had forced upon me had finally come for them. By mid-January, Chloe and I moved into a beautiful sprawling townhouse on Oak Avenue. Juniper's revenue projections skyrocketed past $5 million. I moved my growing team into a massive commercial storefront on Broad Street. Elena began stopping by my office every Tuesday. We were two sisters, digging ourselves out of the wreckage, finally learning how to breathe. The letter arrived in late April. It was a heavy cream-colored envelope sitting in my corporate mailbox. I opened it at my desk. Inside was a single card from Harrison. It contained exactly 7 words. Claire, I finally read the article today. Dad. No apology. No acknowledgement of the cruelty. No request for forgiveness. I didn't call him. I didn't feel the sting of rejection. I just set the card down on my desk, turned back to my computer and went to work. I finally understood that you cannot earn love from people who are entirely unwilling to give it. Setting a boundary is not a betrayal. It is the absolute first honest thing you can do in a relationship built on lies. That evening, I sat on the porch steps of my new townhouse. The spring air was warm. Chloe was sitting beside me, eating chocolate ice cream, laughing loudly at a joke I had just told. There were no shadows hiding us. There was no wind rattling single-pane glass. There was only the sound of my daughter's laughter, echoing loudly into the street. It was exactly what freedom sounded like. There is a profound, undeniable power in finally stepping out of the shadows and owning your worth. If you felt the raw intensity of this journey, if Claire's quiet resilience and ultimate triumph resonated with your own truths, please leave a like and subscribe. We share these deep, transformative stories because there is healing in realizing we are not alone in our battles. Stay connected with us for more powerful narratives that celebrate the strength it takes to finally walk away and build your own empire.